Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
Creativity. It can sometimes sound a bit sweet, but if it were a sweet idea, it wouldn't create the controversy that it attracts. And our guest today, Richard Gerver, is perfect for helping us to think through these themes. He's written multiple books on the topic, and he follows in the footsteps of Sir Ken Robinson, whose TED Talk called Do Skills, and his TED Talk called Do Schools Kill Creativity remains one of the most watched videos on any TED topic out there. The world sadly lost Sir Ken in August 2020, and so we felt it right that the Ideas Hour should pay tribute to his impact and to think about ways that we can carry it forward. We could not have a guest who is more suited to doing that than Richard Gerver. So, David, would you like to explain to our listeners why you think this is such a great match?
Well, thanks, Suzanne. I love the idea that maybe it's actually skills that kill creativity, because that, I think, feeds into all of the dichotomies we're arguing about, skills versus knowledge versus creativity. And I think that's just a brilliant, brilliant slip of the tongue. We'll not get any more of these this morning, but despite that, I am just absolutely delighted to introduce Richard Gerver, not simply because he's a world-renowned writer and speaker, which he is. I mean, he's got more stamps in his passport than any human being is remotely entitled to, nor because he was a highly successful head teacher, but because he's a lovely person, and I really like him. Richard's generous, he's thoughtful, and he's loyal. And despite that incredible success that I spoke about earlier on, right now what he's doing is trying to find ways to get back to his roots, to engage with schools and teachers, and to make a difference for young people, which is essentially what he's all about. Richard's career, I think, took that turn because of the links with Sir Ken Robinson. And there's a really powerful connection between the two of them. So, Richard, welcome to the Ideas Hour.
Hello, both of you. Thank you so much for having me on. And my goodness me, thank you for the introduction. Obviously, my mum sent you the email. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Can you start just by telling us what you think Sir Ken's big idea was? I know you're good at that. And maybe say a little bit about your connection to him.
I mean, look, first of all, I think the thing to say about Ken, and I know we'll come on to this as we go through, is I want people to park whatever polarized view they've had of him up to listening to us talk today, and to ask them to be objective about their judgment, not just as a result of what we say today, but actually of the research maybe they do into his life and his thinking as a follow-up. Because really, we can only scratch the surface, for me, of both his ideas and his impact in the time we've got together today. So, I mean, let's just start. I think it's really important people understand a little bit about his backstory. So he was born in Liverpool in 1950 into a very working class family. He was a very bright young boy, gifted both academically and actually athletically. I think one of his brothers, John, went on to go and play for Everton. And actually, Ken, as a young boy, had been identified as a child with significant talent on the soccer football pitch as well. So he may well have gone down that route. But unfortunately, as with many children of his generation, he woke up one day as a victim of polio. And of course, that changed his life. Now, this is really important, I think, for people to understand where his passion and his research and work through his life came from. Because having been a bright young lad, able-bodied, in a normal school, as was sadly and tragically the case in those days, he suffered from polio and found himself moved into a special school where he was treated suddenly, not only for his physical challenges, but actually in terms of his intellectual ability. So he was suddenly treated as if he was daft. And I think that had a profound impact on Ken, both in terms of his own, you can imagine, his own personality and his passions. You know, as he grew up, it was no accident, for example, that the arts became his passion, and particular dance, because he was always so fascinated with the human body and how it could move and how it interpreted through music and the gift of physicality, everything that brought with it. He was fascinated with every facet of academic life, whether it was the arts, whether it was sciences. So anyway, his big idea, born, I think, out of that horrific experience as a young child himself, was that every human being had potential, every human being had gift and talent, and that every human being had the ability to be creative, but it needed to be enhanced, it needed to be supported. The route to that creative process needed to be found and steered, because creativity, of course, can be found across a whole range of spectrum. It's not a preserve of the arts, and Ken was always very passionate, although he came from an arts background and, of course, was professor of arts education at Warwick, was always very passionate to make sure people didn't see the arts as the preserve and home of creativity. So I think for me, really, we need to expand beyond this idea of creativity. Ken was passionate about human potential and about every individual being able to discover that passion, and for education to be used to support it, enhance it, and help every human being realize it to the best of their potential and society's potential too. So I don't know if that's a long-winded answer, really, but that's Ken, yeah.
So, Richard, there will be lots of people who don't actually know that backstory, and therefore the idea that his work comes from an experience of his childhood is really inspiring. And given that there's so much conversation now about how childhood experiences impact the adult that you become in all sorts of ways, I think that's a brilliant place to start. Can I get you to hone in a teeny bit on where you were going? Why do you think the ideas about creativity matter right now?
I think it's a really powerful question, Suzanne, and I think they've always mattered, but I think they really matter now for all kinds of reasons. And by the way, if I can, I want to expand the term creativity. I want people listening to us today to not, I find it one of those words, you know, even with the grandiose words like love, that it's so overused that I'm not entirely sure anyone truly understands what it means. And I think the problem is it's one of those words that everyone has their own interpretation of. You know, for me, when you think about Ken's definition of creativity, it's something along the lines of for an idea that has value. I think that's his basic kind of interpretation of creativity. And to me, I'd like to expand it, because I actually think that he was talking about curiosity. I think he was talking about confidence, self-expression. But I also think when you unpick so much of his research and work and writing around creativity, in some ways, I keep coming back to the idea that for him, the profoundest definition of creativity was actually the ability to learn. To find something of interest, to have the courage or confidence to explore it, and as a result of that, take yourself down a new journey, a new pathway to a new type of understanding, and something deeply pragmatic, because that journey takes you to a place where that initial germ of an idea or interest becomes something that's usable. And so, for me, one of the things I think is so important for us when we talk about Ken and his work is to link it that way, to actually see his version of creativity as a profound sense of what it means to be a learner, an active learner, both in education and in life. Now, when you pitch it that way, what you start to realize is this, that we are living, and this is, I know it's not a new trope, and for some it may even continue to be an uncomfortable one. We are living in times of rapid change, uncertainty, and transformation. Now, this was happening pre-COVID. It was happening decades ago. And there are people like me, dinosaurs like myself and Ken and David and a whole range of us that have been banging on about this stuff since time immemorial. But of course, what the last few years of lived experience have taught us is just how profound and powerful that change is linked to uncertainty and transformation. Now, in the context of your question, I think over the last decade or so, certainly over the last decade or so, in many jurisdictions around the world, and particularly in the most developed jurisdictions, education has got stuck in a policy loop which seems to be almost entirely focused on making the existing system be more efficient. Now, one of the great problems with that is, and if you think about the industrial thinking that brought about mass education in the first instance, it was about industrial thinking. It was preparing young people to live out an industrial journey through their lives, wherever that be, whatever route that was, whatever socioeconomic demographic that might have been at. And actually, it was always about teaching young people to develop the knowledge and skills to live lives of certainty. Now, what we've seen profoundly amplified over the last 2 years is the world simply isn't like that anymore. And I'm not sure many of us are particularly well prepared to live in a life of constant change, of constant uncertainty, of constant shift. And therefore, Ken's view of creativity in the broader sense I've tried to highlight to people, I think is more profoundly important now than ever it has been. Because what we need are people that have the ability to see new things, to find them of interest, to have the confidence to embrace them, to go on new journeys, to seek new pathways, and to feel comfortable in environments where they're not 100% secure and everything around them isn't 100% certain. And therefore, education has to play a key role in helping shift the mindset and prepare young people to see the world differently, to attack it differently, and to be able, therefore, to take a greater sense of ownership of what is an incredibly uncertain but very exciting future. Sorry if that was a rant, by the way.
Well, I love a rant. And I, as you know, Richard, there's nothing I like better than a good rant myself as well. But I mean, I love the power of that. I love the power of that. I love the passion behind that. And I think you're absolutely right around that idea that, you know, it's the learner that will inherit the earth, that in times of change and uncertainty, it's that capacity to learn. And I think there's a real tension around now in the public debate amongst those who don't want people to have that capacity in a wide scale because it threatens control. And so I think we're seeing a huge move against that. And what we've got, I think, is the opportunity to get into a massive debate around these huge issues. But just to bring us back a wee bit, you know, we'll talk more later about the practical implications of all of this for schools. But I absolutely loved your first book, Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today. It's one of the finest collections, I think, of ideas around school improvement, interlaced with a narrative about your experience as a head teacher and the journey that you made with your school. Can you maybe just tell us a bit about that book, Richard, which to a huge extent is the story of your headship and it's the foundation of your leadership, and how you put these ideas into practice? And if I might just backtrack a bit, it was through that experience that you came into contact with Ken Robinson. And I'd still quite like you to tell everyone the story of that, because I think it really humanizes Ken.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, let's take it back. So I started, for those that haven't heard the story or aren't too sick to death of hearing it, I was privileged enough to become the head teacher of Grange Primary School in Long Eaton at the turn of the millennium. And just so people know, by the way, I didn't get the job because I was a wunderkind, because anyone that knows me is I'm still staggeringly young to have been a head teacher. I left the job 14 years ago. So, just before anyone asks. But I took on the headship, not because I was a wunderkind, but because genuinely I was the only applicant for the post in that school. I won't go into the detail now, but suffice to say, the school was really struggling and had been struggling for nearly a decade. And it had been through a number of heads, and as in a lot of schools in challenging circumstances find themselves, that kind of churn. Anyway, I started the job, was passionate about this community. We went through an extraordinary journey together. And whilst I have made a career out of taking credit for it, what's really important for people to recognize is I was the catalyst, but I actually did nothing. The community changed that school in remarkable ways. And again, for another day, one of the important things for me about leadership that I learned from that experience was it was never my job. It's not the leader's job to generate the ideas, to come up with all the solutions. It's about asking the right questions. It's about empowering your community and actually then auditing what you're doing against a set of agreed criteria, whether that's vision, values, outcomes, whatever that might be. Anyway, as a result of the journey, we started doing some very innovative stuff, I think even by today's standards. And about 2 years in, as a result, I was invited to go and speak at a head teachers leaders conference in the north of England, to do a little workshop. And the main keynote speaker before we broke out into the little workshops was Sir Ken Robinson. Now, people need to remember that this was pre-social media. This was pre-TED, his TED speech even. And he was talking about all our futures, which again, we might come back to, which was the report that he chaired in 1998. But anyway, so I wouldn't have known what Ken looked like, as a lot of people wouldn't, because, you forget, don't you, how accessible now image ideas and all the rest of it are because of social media. So I went to listen to this guy who I'd heard of. And of course, for anyone that heard him live, whether you agree with him or not, the one thing I think everyone, if they're generous enough to, can agree on with Ken Robinson, he is quite possibly, arguably, the greatest live keynote speaker, one of them certainly, on the planet. He was one of the greatest communicators I've ever had the privilege to see. And of course, if you're about to go and run a workshop for a group of people that have just sat in on one of the greatest keynote expositions in the history of the world, you hate that person for delivering. I mean, with a passion, right? And so I stood at the back of the room, listened to this man for over an hour. And by the way, this is also really important. Again, we'll come back to this. There are too many people around the world who judge Ken on the 18 minutes of his TED speech, and that's all they judge him on. And they accuse him of being superficial and headliney and not having any details or knowledge or, all I say to those people is go and immerse yourself in his writing, his research, longer speeches, because it's very lazy to accuse any human being of being whatever you accuse them of on the basis of an 18-minute speech, right? Just anyway, an aside. So the hour blew me away. My mind was buzzing. For the first time ever, I'd heard somebody with real credibility basically vocalize so much of what I'd been passionate about in my professional capacity as a teacher and a head, and so many of the things I'd believed in and we'd started to catalyze at Grange. Anyway, again, this is a very rambling explanation. I hope people aren't too bored by this. I went off to do my workshop. About a dozen people of the 500 rocked up into my room, and I was thrilled. Frankly, I was thrilled. And I was about to start when in walked Sir Ken Robinson, which frankly is more unwelcome in that moment in your life than an inspection from Ofsted or anybody else, right? And he went and sat at the back of the room. And you know how I delivered the thing to the room. Everybody seemed to enjoy it. But I kept looking, obviously, at this newfound hero I had. And he was expressionless, and he waited for everyone else to leave the room. He sat there with his arms folded. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? Anyway, when everyone had left the room, he stood up, came over to me, hugged me, and said, Richard, I'm really quite emotional. That's the first time I've heard a practitioner deliver on so many of the things I've been passionate about in the 40 years of my career. Can we have dinner? And that's where our friendship began. So a number of years later, when Grange had really become fully formed, and Ken was saying to me, you know, Richard, the next phase of your career, you need to come out and you need to share your story, not just the Grange story, but actually you've achieved more around leadership and realizing human potential than you'd ever know. Because even to this day, I've always just believed I've done the job everybody else, you know, like all of us in education. You just rock up every day and do the job you believe in because it's the job you do, right? It's what we do. And it took his eyes to go, you know, some of what you've achieved is remarkable and you need to share that with the world. And of one of those things he said to me was, I want you to write it down. I want you to write a book on your vision, values, your beliefs behind what you achieved at Grange and the Grange story while it's still fresh in your mind. And he said, if you do, I promise you I'll write the foreword to the books. So, because, of course, I said, well, who's going to be interested in a primary school head teacher from a place in the UK no one's ever heard of? And he said, I'll write the foreword. So again, move forward a bit. I wrote the first draft. I sent it to him and I heard nothing for a couple of months. And then I got this email and I remember it clearly. I'd just pulled up at a venue to go and deliver a speech. And the email came through from Ken on my phone and it said, Richard, look, I need to be honest with you. You know, the story's great, but this manuscript is awful. And he said, if this is the manuscript you're going to submit in this form, I cannot put my name to this. He said, however, if you're prepared to, I am happy to help you work on this so that it has the validity it deserves. That was the point. He didn't want my story to be watered down by my inability to tell the story properly or to evidence it. He said, so if you're prepared for me to help you, I will help you put this together. And of course, you know, like we all do, my ego in that moment went into overdrive. I bloody hate him. What does he know? I was ready to march off and tell him to do one. And of course, luckily, I calmed down and of course, emailed him back and he helped me craft that first book into what I'm very proud of and I believe is still of value to people. Now, the couple of things there for me, David and Suzanne, I think are really important about the man. First of all, and again, this goes to some of the crass accusations that are made about him. People need to remember he was a professor of education at a university. His entire life was about the authenticity and integrity of deep research. And one of the reasons he disliked my first manuscript was that he didn't feel for the story I was telling there was enough evidence or research to back up my instincts. And one of the things he insisted on was that I actually drilled in to be able to evidence and prove objectively some of what I'd believed reflexively as a professional. The second thing that I think marks him out to me, and when I look back, and it didn't take me long to realize, was his act of love and generosity. Because I think it takes a hell of a person. You know, the easy out in that would have been, yeah, Richard, it's smashing, lovely, no problem. But actually, the act, generosity and love of a really passionate educator and friend and mentor was to say to me, Richard, this is not good enough. But then rather than just passing judgment to say, but I am prepared to help you learn and develop it into something of value. And that to me has always marked out, you know, the authenticity and trust that a great educator shows is to be honest, but also to inspire love and trust in the people they're working with and teaching. And Ken did that in the first act of our relationship together. And it's why I so trusted his judgment on anything we ever talked about in the following years, because I knew he was honest and I knew he wouldn't blow smoke up my backside. And I knew that if something wasn't working or needed greater integrity or investigation, he would tell me. And therefore, when I got praise from him, as any of us do from any great educator we've been lucky enough to be in a relationship with, you knew that praise was earned and it was of value and it was real. So his authenticity, his generosity to lift anybody up, to support them. I was lucky because I got in before he became Ted Ken, as I called him. And therefore I was on the list that got to know him early and built a relationship with him. It was much harder for him once he became a kind of global megastar, but I still saw it in him in his interactions with people. He was a genuine, passionate educator who wanted to lift people up, make them better, and help them tell their story. So I hope that, just in a long-winded way, David, kind of helps people understand the book and where it came from and my relationship to Ken.
You need to stop saying long-winded, Richard. It's not long-winded, it's passionate. You're saying so much because it means so much, and that's why you're here. Just 2 or 3 things. One of the things you've just done is to powerfully associate Ken Robinson with rigor, and that's the word that's only ever used to criticize him, never to praise him. So I think that's a hugely, hugely important step. Second thing is the emphasis on kindness. One of the really good books to come out recently is Dave Whitaker. Dave's an executive head for a cluster of special schools, and he talks about teaching with kindness. And I think these comments absolutely capture the importance of that. And the third thing is that one of the things that I talk about a lot is that the role of the educator is to hold up a mirror to the child in which they see a better reflection of themselves, and then to enable that reflection to become the reality. And it's brilliant to hear that applied to staff development, if you like, because that's essentially what it was. But I'm cutting across Suzanne because it's your question, Suzanne. Passing back to you.
I'm really struck, Richard, in you talking about help, right? So you just told us a really powerful and personal story, which I think is brilliant, because what it says is you took work too. You needed help too. And sometimes all we see is the outcome, and we don't know about the journey that a child or a person or organization or a school has made. And we're disempowered in understanding how achievement, if you want to call it that, is achieved. Okay, so you just said, I needed help when I struggled. And I'm at the moment thinking about all of the schools and teachers who punish children when they don't achieve, and it isn't followed by help. So why do you think not everybody supplies help? Can you, it's really, you have contextualized struggle in a relationship. Why is that hard for us to understand and get that, do you think?
God, I think it's such a powerful question, Suzanne. And I think, there are so many reasons. The first is, I think as a profession, particularly our younger members of our profession, have been raised under so much pressure to deliver in fixed ways, fixed methodologies, fixed outcomes. I actually believe, and I don't think this is necessarily new, because when I look back on my own career, we are always living in a world where somebody is selling us the new silver bullet, the new big idea. This is the answer, right? When I was a young teacher, there was loads of stuff around creativity as the answer. And then we had things like VACing, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and that was the answer. And then we had, learning to learn, the answer. And that now we've got cognitive science, which is the answer. So what happens is we've got a profession who, first of all, I think, are being deprofessionalized perversely, because they're being told that actually, unless they understand this, do it this way, use this system, they're actually not valid. So what happens is you depersonalize their ability as an educator, you overcomplicate the world they're in, you put ridiculous pressures on them for very fixed outcomes and measure them against very narrow criteria. And so teachers feel like they're drowning. A lot of teachers feel like they're absolutely in self-preservation mode. And actually, when your back's against a wall and all the help you seem to be getting is do it this way, this is the answer. If you don't understand it and you don't do it this way, you're exposing your own lack of professionalism, whatever else it is. It becomes a very technical profession. And of course, the one thing we know about education, well, a number of things we know about education. First of all, the truth is about education and achievement, as you've said, is you learn nothing new by getting something right. You only ever learn something new from the point of a mistake or the realization you don't know something or you can't do something. Yet the system is still predicated on rewarding people for getting stuff right and punishing people for getting stuff wrong or demonizing them because the accusation is you didn't listen hard enough, you weren't working hard enough, you didn't put enough hours in, which again is a very kind of Taylorist industrial viewpoint. And education is just not industrial, right? So there's a number of things. Firstly, a number of teachers are under immense pressure and they are being judged on outcomes. So they project that entire way of thinking onto their students. We don't see failure as the magic moment because, of course, the one thing going back to Ken's philosophy and actually the known understanding of innovation and creativity is innovation and creativity only comes from those moments of mistakes where something goes wrong. Two things to say there of recent conversations I've had in the last few years, which kind of resonate for me. One was with Barry Barish, who was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics, who said to me, you know, Richard, the most important thing about the people I pulled together to be in my research team, that went on, I'll just remind people, to win the 2017 Nobel Prize for physics was people, all of the people in my team all had to have the ability to ask stupid questions. Now, just let people dwell on that for a minute, right? Because there's a whole, right, we could have a whole nother conversation about what that means. But that means you've got to be in a psychologically safe environment, right? You've got to be able to make the risk of looking stupid, saying something that you're really worried might make you judge, saying something that could be wrong. And actually, that is the only way you learn something new. And the other thing was a meeting with a professor of pure mathematics. And I remember saying to them, how on earth do you judge a doctoral thesis in pure mathematics? Because with my naive artsy background, I thought it's just, the back page of the textbook where the really hard sums are, and you just get lots and lots of ticks. And she said to me, Richard, a doctoral thesis in pure mathematics is all about showing that you have the ability to challenge the beauty of the proof. So, right, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that just poetically? And that comes from a pure mathematician, the ability to challenge the beauty of the proof. So the one thing we know is that learning has to be about challenging convention. It has to be not just accepting that there is a black and white, a right or wrong. It has to be about being able to ask stupid questions. It has to be about being able to admit weakness, a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, a lack of skill. And therefore, teaching has to be about promoting cultures that allow those things to flourish. And therefore, what we need is a profession who are encouraged to think and behave that way, who are re-professionalized, who grow in the confidence of their own instincts and ability. Because in my experience, the best educators I've ever met are not the ones with a gun filled with silver bullets, but the ones that trust their own instincts, that build deep relationships of trust and respect with their students, so they understand the needs in each and every one of those students. But also, most importantly, what they do is they build a culture of psychological safety, which allows the stupid questions. It allows young people to challenge the beauty of the proof. And that's where the magic of learning really happens. And so for me, we have to, at a whole leadership level, at a policy level, encourage our colleagues to trust their instincts, to trust their own experiences, and to trust that the heart of education, whilst never easy, by God, teaching is a complex and challenging thing to do. It's a lot more simple than it's being sold as, because at the heart, for me, it's about human relationships.
So, Richard, I hear you saying two key things in there. One is that creativity is not sweet, that creativity is really radical and challenging. And I also hear you saying by implication that creativity helps children to heal from difficult times. So I'm thinking about all the discussion around trauma that we're having in the wider, profession and society at the moment. You think creativity is helpful to healing children with trauma. By implication, is that right?
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely, Suzanne. And again, if people don't mind me being personal, I want to tell you where my own, it's really interesting as you get older and you have space and time to think and reflect, you start to unpack your own life, don't you? And why you think the way you do and behave the way you do, and you're passionate. Why, for example, was I so drawn to Ken, who I very proudly was able to call my professional father? And why do I describe him that way? And why do I look back on him with that level of love and affection? And I think in my life, I've had a number of figures like that who have helped me. And the first was actually when I was a young child at school. My parents went through a spectacularly messy divorce that was filled with all kinds of trauma, that sadly more and more children feel today than ever they did. And my parents went through that spectacularly messy divorce at a time where, divorce was still very frowned on societally, and particularly in the kind of social middle class circles that my parents moved, right? So, and actually often my brother and I were the brunt of it was taken out on us, some of that anger and trauma. And so as a young child, I exhibited some of the behaviors that many kids who've been through far worse than me. I was, relatively lucky. I developed a stutter, which was to do with nerves. And I also was wetting the bed as a 9-10-year-old kid on a regular basis, which of course was mortifying. And the funny thing was, at that time, I had a teacher called David, and I won't tell you the whole story now, because if people want to look it up, he was part of the subject of my TED speech. But I was lucky enough to have this teacher, David, who, when I look back, taught me so much, not just about how to help me develop out of and make sense of my own life at that point, but actually later on as an educator, because he was one of those rare teachers that really got to understand me, my background, my history, why the behaviors were the way they were, and particularly around the stammer, because he was an English and drama teacher. And as a young kid, he actually persuaded me to be in a play that he was producing at school, because he believed that part of my problem was I'd become so lacking in confidence around my own personality, my own voice and stuff, that the stammer came from me being really almost second guessing that I had anything to project of value. And his belief was that if I actually spoke somebody else's words and inhabited somebody else's character, that would help me grow, right? And so that's what happened. And, it is remarkable to me now that 40 plus years later, I now stand on stages and speak in public, partly for a living, right? Because if that depth of understanding and compassion and how to use creativity in its widest sense, for him to think creatively outside of the box as a teacher, to get to know me, to encourage me in a particular way, to develop something that wasn't about exams, and it wasn't about marks, and it wasn't about subjects or core curriculum or timetabled stuff, then I wouldn't have become the person I'd become. Because actually that process, his interaction, his relationship with me helped me not just come to terms with some of my trauma, but more importantly, helped me on a very personal level to understand how I could journey out of that trauma and give me a sense of purpose and value, which helped me rebuild my self-confidence, which helped me to develop again as a young person with opportunity.
One of the things I'm really enjoying about this conversation, Richard, is the way that you move so easily between experience and ideas. Lots of the anecdotes almost that you recount lead brilliantly to big ideas. That last part was really highlighting the importance of recognition and identity and the role that we as educators can play in giving young people that. And one of your strengths, I think, is that you do this constantly, this linking between experience and anecdote and ideas. And you are a significant thinker in your own right. And as I said at the start, you've got a number of books that you've written. You've got your book Change, you've got a manifesto for educational change, you've got the recent publication of Simple Thinking, all in addition to your first book, which we talked about. And there's an updated edition of that out as well. So you're doing all right for a boy with a stammer. You know, I mean, I honestly think they should have done you rather than the King's speech. I think you're far, far better example than the King. But what I would love to do now is to give you the opportunity to give us a sense of the main ideas that you're trying to get across in the books that you've written, and then where they dovetail with the work that we've been discussing from Sir Ken on creativity.
Well, wow. Thank you, David. No mean feat. I mean, the first thing to say is I would always describe myself as an accidental author, even an accidental speaker. You know, I was a passionate teacher. It was my career. That's all I really wanted to do. And because of some of the things I've talked about and happenstance, things changed. I wrote the first book because Ken really persuaded me to do so. And I honestly believe that was the only thing I would have of any value to share with anybody in writing. And also, you know, I'm one of these people, I don't know how many other people have experienced this. When you'd write something, when you do it, you think, God, that's it. That's my idea. That's done. And I've always passionately believed in authenticity. I try never to speak about stuff that isn't something I feel passionate about, that I've lived, that I can make those connections with. I'm not an academic. I'm not an intellectual, and I'm not an anti-academic or intellectual. It's just not what I am. Everything I do comes through my experience and reflection of that. So the other books, you know, Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today in its day sold really well, right place, right time. And what that did was it attracted other publishers to approach me. And one publisher came to see me and said, look, we'd really like you to write a book. And actually, we'd like you to write a book that maybe has resonance and value beyond education. Is there anything that interests you? And so Change came about, which was my second book, because I'd started to inhabit worlds inside and outside of education and become fascinated with the human condition around why it is we find change so difficult as human beings. And particularly on the reflection from some of my education background, that actually it seemed to me, having been privileged enough to work in schools with early years units and nurseries, you know, that you hang out in those organizations, you hang out with really young kids, and you see the world's greatest authorities on managing and leading change. And the problem is they're all under 5, right? So that's where this root of my life always comes from. Why is that? And what happens? And what happens and what could we do if we understood how we become increasingly change averse? So that's how that book came about. Again, organically, really, from my own experiences, my own lived reflections. I was very lucky that book sold very well, and amazingly publishers came back and said, what else you got? And I thought, well, I don't know. And really, Simple Thinking, which was the third book, evolved out of Change, which was part of that exploration, was then what we do in order to justify our judgment. We start to second guess, we overcomplicate stuff in order to justify it. And I really wanted to explore the essence of what success meant, and whether success really was complex and the preserve of a lucky few, and, you know, and was it really complicated, or could you simplify all of that? So again, for me, it's an exploration of human condition, human potential, the absolute belief that we are all capable of more than we ever believed, and particularly those children who are born into environments which are more challenging, which lack certain levels of support, all of that, which is all my foundational belief. And then the final book, up till now, I'll leave that as a little teaser, up till now, Education, a Manifesto for Change, was really I was never going to write another book about education, because if I'm honest, I thought, having by that stage spent more than a decade out of the front line, what on earth did I had to add? And really, was I, you know, what right would I have to write about the education landscape over a decade after leaving the front line? And that book really was a culmination of the first 3 books, and particularly Change in Simple Thinking, but related back into the education context. Because really now, for the last 14 or 15 years since I left frontline education, the number of experiences I've had, the number of people I've met that have not just rocked my world, but the number of times I've thought, oh my God, I wished I'd known that when I was an educator. I wish I'd known that when I was a teacher or a head. And the book was born out of my belief that I wonder if I can share those experiences back on the front line with educators. So although it's secondhand, they can have the kind of catalyst experiences I had to help generate and develop their thinking. So I think in answer to the question, that my whole life, my books, everything I talk about, write about, is kind of organically born out of that absolute passionate belief in the potential of human beings, and how through an educator's lens, we can try and amplify and opportunitize. I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm going to claim it as mine. Opportunitize that right for every single child, no matter where they come from. And then also for adults that maybe have never had that opportunity and find themselves in different walks of life. And I think that really is where my life with Ken dovetails, and what he brought out of me, and the commonality in spirit. Because again, the one thing Ken cared about, first of all, he was never polarizing as a person. He never believed in black or white, right or wrong, progressive or traditional. He believed in the potency and power of every human being and their right to live life to the fullest, and the power of education as the catalyst to try and make that possible for as many people as possible. So I suppose our link, our deep shared passion, is in the absolute belief in human potential and every human being's right to at least try to find it and explore it. In the decade or so I've had since I left education, one of those privileges that I refer to in Education and Manifesto for Change is spending time in some of the world's most dynamic and creative organizations outside of education, particularly in the arts, in new tech, in sports, really interesting, globally significant organizations. And it's led me to believe that there are 2 types of organization in the world right now. I mean, it's a crass generalization, but I hope it works for the purposes of this question. One is very traditional methodology of running, managing an organization, which I call the assumption of incompetence. So in other words, it's bound around Taylorism, that focus on efficiency. If you focus on efficiency, it leads to productivity. Increased productivity leads to profit. Increased profit, you plow back into efficiency. You create the perfect industrial model. And unfortunately, a lot of our policy leaders, politicians, and some of that cabal believe that is the answer to education, right? It's all about efficiency. It's about children as machines, as cogs in a machine. And it's purely about delivering to them in a way to get more and more academic churn, more academic results, more qualifications, and somehow that improves their economic opportunity and life chances. Very traditional. But the assumption of incompetence comes in because the way you manage that is by the default model of believing everybody is incompetent unless they are managed to be competent. So the policy level belief around children is they're born naughty, they're born lazy, they're born rubbish. And actually the whole role of education is to bash that out of them and at least get them to competency and compliance, right? So totally misunderstanding human nature, human potential, and who we are as human beings. But I understand the model because it's the way most traditional organizations are run. Traditional companies are run that way, right? Traditional performance management targets. So everyone has to prove their value to at least be competent before you can go anywhere near allowing them to flourish beyond that. And that's very much the policy philosophy around the current English government and their education system and the people they surround them with. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to me is the world's most dynamic organizations in the 21st century operate under something called what I call the assumption of excellence. In other words, the belief that every human being in that organization is outstanding. And our job is to provide the climate, resource, and environment for them to to flourish and be outstanding. That doesn't mean you absolve yourself of responsibility or expectation, because you intervene as and when you need to. But what you don't do is make everybody reach the same level of competence before you let a few through the glass ceiling, right? You do it the other way. And also what's interesting is, for anyone listening to this thinking, oh, but Richard, that's really ideological and a bit soft and soapy. By my experience, it is far more challenging for individuals to operate under an assumption of excellence than it is an assumption of incompetence. And again, this is a big danger around current policy and education, because in a culture of assumed incompetence, anyone working underneath the hierarchy or leadership can blame somebody above them for their lack of performance, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a child, anyone. You can go, well, it's the rules, it's the system, it's the boss, it's my teacher, it's the leader, it's the middle manager. It's their fault because that's how I'm managed, right? But in a culture of assumed excellence, the spotlight is firmly on you to achieve beyond your expectations. And therefore, you have far greater level of responsibility and accountability for your performance. And that's why a lot of people talk about wanting more freedom, more opportunity. But when you actually change the game and put the spotlight on them, they shirt back into the shadows, because we've never been educated to live in the spotlight, to believe we are personally responsible and accountable. So the real danger of what is being said at the moment around behavior, around social mobility, is it's going to have totally the opposite effect. Because what it does is continue to perpetuate the myth for human beings that their life is in somebody else's hands and that somebody else is always responsible for it. And if we continue to perpetuate a culture of assumed incompetence, then we are going to continue to perpetuate a life where when people move into adulthood, they are going to become angrier and angrier and angrier because they've done everything they've been asked to do and nothing they've been promised had been delivered on. And as a result, we're going to see more polarization, more anger, more populism, because the world's turning faster and we're continuing to prepare people to live in an industrial age in a culture of assumed incompetence. And that's why, for me, fundamentally, we have to shift that. My belief is that most people who work with young people can see that problem and challenge. What we have to do is, on an individual basis, is have the courage just to shift the dial in our own environment, our own classroom, our own school, our own college. And we need to stop existing under this kind of policy culture of assumed incompetence.
Richard, I'm almost tempted to come back and say, can we make this a double header? The remaining question that we should be asking is about what the practical implications of this are for teachers in classrooms and schools. And my fear now is that we rush at the answer to that. So what I would like to do is I would like to ask you to come back. I think you've touched on so many big ideas and themes, and to explore these further, and also to do justice to that question about what the implications are in terms of practice for schools and teachers. And I think if you are willing to do that, if the listeners are in any way close to my levels of enjoyment and enthusiasm for this discussion, another hour probably wouldn't be enough. It's been a brilliant hour, Richard. Thank you.
David, Suzanne, I would be honoured and delighted to come back and rant some more. Honestly, you only have to invite me. I'd love to. If people want to listen, I'm more than happy to continue to share our thinking.
If you'd like more from Richard, you can check out his website, richardgerver.com. You could check out any of his several books like Education, A Manifesto for Change, or Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today, or you might even find him on a future episode really soon.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.